It was another ordinary morning at the high-rise office downtown, a place where success seemed to echo through every glass-walled meeting room. People in sharp suits bustled about, their polished shoes clicking against the marble floors. Among them was a man whose presence commanded attention the moment he walked into the room. He was wealthy, powerful, and well aware of it. His crisp white shirt and tailored suit screamed luxury, and his voice, though smooth, often carried an edge that could cut through even the most confident of colleagues. To him, power wasn't just a tool, it was a weapon, one he wielded effortlessly. Then there was his assistant. Quiet, meticulous, and diligent, he had worked there for years, ensuring every detail of the man's demanding schedule was flawless. His demeanor was calm, almost stoic, but those who took the time to notice saw quiet strength in him. He wasn't flashy, didn't demand recognition, and rarely spoke unless spoken to. But beneath his composed exterior was a mind sharp enough to rival anyone in the office. That morning, the air was charged with tension. The man stormed into the office, his face etched with annoyance. Something had gone wrong in a meeting earlier that day, and he wasn't in the mood for excuses. His assistant, as usual, was waiting patiently at his desk, ready to address whatever needed fixing. The moment their eyes met, the man's voice sliced through the air. "Do you even know what you're doing here?" he snapped, throwing a folder onto the desk. Papers scattered everywhere. The assistant calmly began gathering them, his movements steady and unhurried, as if years of dealing with such outbursts had taught him not to react. But the man wasn't done. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice just enough for only the two of them to hear. "You should be grateful you even have a job here. People like you don't get opportunities like this every day. If it weren't for me, where would you even be?" His words were laced with condescension, his tone implying more than just frustration. The room seemed to freeze for a moment. Nearby colleagues glanced over, pretending not to hear but unable to ignore the scene unfolding. The assistant paused, his hands still resting on the scattered papers. Slowly, he looked up, meeting the man's gaze directly for the first time that day. His expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes, a quiet defiance, a strength that refused to be diminished. Before he could respond, the man turned away, muttering under his breath about incompetence as he stalked off toward his private office. The assistant straightened, gathering the papers into a neat stack before sitting back down at his desk. He didn't say a word, but something about the way he carried himself in that moment left the onlookers in quiet awe. What no one in that office knew, not even the man who prided himself on knowing everything about everyone, was that the assistant had a plan, one that would shake the very foundation of the power dynamics in that company. What was coming next would be something no one, especially the rich man, could have ever expected. And it all started with that quiet moment of defiance. The assistant sat at his desk, his mind calm despite the storm of words he had just endured. Years of working in an environment like this had taught him how to compartmentalize, how to absorb without breaking. But this time, something felt different. That comment, "People like you don't get opportunities like this," hung in the air like an echo that wouldn't fade. It wasn't just the words themselves, it was the unspoken weight behind them. It was the kind of statement that had layers, each one more cutting than the last. As the day unfolded, the assistant continued with his tasks as if nothing had happened. Emails were sent, meetings were scheduled, and projects were managed with the same quiet efficiency as always. But beneath his calm exterior, he was replaying the moment in his mind, examining it from every angle. The rich man had always been demanding, often dismissive, but today had crossed a line. It wasn't just about a bad mood or a stressful day. It was something deeper, something uglier. And for the first time in a long time, the assistant felt the stirrings of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: resolve. He had grown up understanding what it meant to be underestimated. From an early age, he had learned to navigate a world that often saw him as less, as someone who didn't belong in spaces like this. but instead of letting it defeat him, he had used it as fuel. Every condescending look, every dismissive comment, every closed door, they had all been stepping stones. He had worked harder, stayed later, and pushed further than anyone else around him because he knew he had to. It wasn't just about proving others wrong, it was about proving to himself that he deserved to be here. The assistant hadn't always planned on working in the corporate world. In fact, his ambitions had once been far removed from the towering office buildings and endless spreadsheets. He had dreams of building something of his own, something that mattered. But life had a way of steering people off course, and circumstances had led him here. The paycheck was steady, the job secure, and for a while, that had been enough. He had told himself that he was just biding his time, saving up for when he could finally chase his own vision. But as the years went by, that dream began to feel more and more like a distant memory. That evening, as the office emptied out and the hum of conversations faded into silence, the assistant stayed behind. He often worked late, but tonight wasn't about catching up on emails or preparing for the next day's meetings. Tonight was about something bigger. He pulled out a small notebook he kept tucked away in his drawer, one he hadn't opened in years. Its pages were filled with ideas, plans, and sketches, traces of the dream he had put on hold. Flipping through it, he felt a surge of energy he hadn't felt in a long time. He thought about the comment the rich man had made that morning. It wasn't the first time he had been spoken to that way, and it wouldn't be the last. But it was the first time he truly saw it for what it was, a challenge. Not a challenge to his ability, but to his worth. And that was something he wasn't willing to let slide anymore. The next few weeks brought little change on the surface. The assistant continued his work with the same quiet diligence, navigating the demands of the office with his usual calm. But behind the scenes, something was brewing. He began waking up earlier, spending his mornings on projects of his own before heading into the office. Late nights were no longer about staying ahead at work, they were about staying ahead of the life he wanted to create. Slowly but surely, he was building something that no one else could take credit for. Meanwhile, the rich man remained oblivious. To him, the assistant was just another cog in the machine, someone to keep things running smoothly without making waves. He prided himself on his ability to read people, to spot potential, or the lack of it. And in his eyes, the assistant was nothing more than a reliable worker, someone who knew his place. He didn't see the spark beneath the surface, the quiet determination that was growing stronger every day. But others in the office were starting to notice. The assistant's demeanor hadn't changed, but there was a new energy about him, a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. Colleagues who had always dismissed him as background noise began to take a second look. They noticed the way he carried himself, the way he seemed to anticipate problems before they arose. Some even started coming to him for advice, drawn to the calm authority he exuded. One afternoon, as the assistant was going over the schedule for the following week, a junior employee approached him. She was nervous, clutching a folder tightly to her chest. "Can I ask you something?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked up, offering a reassuring smile. "Of course. What's on your mind?" She hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "How do you do it? Stay so calm, I mean. Even when..." She trailed off, but they both knew what she meant. Even when someone like the rich man treated you the way he did. The assistant leaned back in his chair, considering her question. "You have to remember why you're here," he said finally. "Not for them, not for their approval. You're here for you. If you let their opinions define your worth, you'll never see your own potential." She nodded slowly, his words sinking in. It wasn't a grand speech or a dramatic moment, but it was enough. And as she walked away, the assistant couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction. He wasn't just building something for himself, he was laying the foundation for something bigger, something that could inspire others to do the same. The tension in the office continued to simmer beneath the surface. The rich man remained as dismissive and demanding as ever, unaware of the changes happening right under his nose. But change was coming, and it was only a matter of time before the balance of power shifted in ways no one could have predicted. The days turned into weeks, and with each passing moment, the assistant felt a growing sense of purpose. It was subtle at first, a quiet shift in his routine. But there was something in the air now, an undercurrent of anticipation, a feeling that change was inevitable. His late nights continued, but he wasn't just building his own plans anymore. He was laying out the groundwork for something bigger, something that would alter the way the entire office saw him. And with each step he took, he couldn't help but feel that the moment of reckoning was drawing nearer. Meanwhile, the rich man carried on as if nothing had changed. He floated through his days with the same arrogance, assuming that everything was going according to plan. His empire was built on the backs of those who worked for him, but he had always been quick to remind them that they were replaceable, easily swapped out for someone else who could do the job just as well or better, in his mind. He had no time for weakness, for anything less than perfection. And for the most part, people accepted it. After all, who could argue with success? But the assistant was no longer content with just accepting it. He had spent years trying to prove himself, trying to get the recognition that seemed to always slip through his fingers. Every time the rich man barked an order, dismissed him with a wave of his hand, or undermined his efforts, it chipped away at something inside him. He had always been the model of composure, the picture of professional detachment. But now, that detachment was beginning to feel like a mask he was ready to tear off. One afternoon, during a high-stakes meeting with clients, the rich man's behavior reached a new low. His sharp words cut through the room like a knife, making the clients visibly uncomfortable. The assistant, standing just off to the side, could see the cracks forming. His sharp tone, his inflated sense of superiority today, it was all too much. He watched as one of the clients subtly shifted in their seat, eyes darting to the assistant for a moment of relief, a moment of understanding. The assistant didn't move, didn't acknowledge the look. But inside, he felt something stir, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel before: empathy. As the meeting wound down, the assistant went to retrieve some documents from the back office. The rich man, having finished with the clients, was already making his way out of the room, barking orders into his phone, not even acknowledging the assistant's presence. But as he walked by, something in his expression faltered for a split second. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but the assistant caught at the momentary glance that wasn't filled with contempt, but something darker. Fear? Regret? He couldn't quite place it. But for the first time in a long time, he wondered if the rich man knew more than he let on. If he had any idea about the power dynamics shifting around him. Back at his desk, the assistant pulled out his notebook again. The plans he'd started were now taking shape, and his quiet revolution was moving from the realm of ideas into something more tangible. But the deeper he delved into it, the more complicated it became. The more he realized that if he wanted to truly succeed, it wasn't just about outshining the rich man, it was about finding allies, people who could help him bring about the change he was seeking. He couldn't do it alone. He began to reach out, carefully testing the waters with a few colleagues, sensing their frustrations, their discontent with the status quo. Some were eager to listen, others skeptical, but each conversation added a new layer to his plans. It wasn't just about taking down one man, it was about changing the entire system that had allowed people like him to be treated as disposable. One such colleague, a mid-level manager who had worked in the office for years, seemed to sense the shift in the assistant's attitude. He'd been there when the rich man had made his rude comments, when the assistant had been humiliated. He had witnessed the quiet resilience the assistant had always displayed, and something about it intrigued him. One evening, as they both stayed late working on a report, the manager approached the assistant's desk. "You know," he began, his voice low, You've been handling a lot more than most people realize. I've seen the way he treats you, and it's not right." The assistant didn't look up at first, focused on his work. But he could feel the weight of the manager's gaze. Finally, he met the man's eyes. "Why do you care?" the assistant asked, his voice steady but guarded. He had learned long ago not to show vulnerability, not to reveal too much. The manager shifted his weight, hesitating for a moment. "Because I've seen what you're capable of. You've got something that he doesn't. People like him, he's only successful because everyone around him believes they have no other choice but to follow his lead. But you? You don't need to follow. And that's a rare thing in a place like this." The words hung in the air between them, and the assistant felt a flicker of something inside him. This wasn't just sympathy. This was recognition. For the first time in a long while, someone saw him as more than just a silent worker. And that recognition, though small, felt like a crack in the foundation of the world he had known. But even as he allowed himself to consider the possibilities of what this connection could mean, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something darker was at play. The rich man's arrogance had always been a shield, but what if it wasn't just arrogance? What if there was something deeper beneath the surface, something that made him lash out, something that drove him to maintain control at any cost? That evening, as the assistant walked home, he found himself thinking more and more about the rich man. About the way he had reacted to certain situations, the way he held his power so tightly, as if afraid to let it slip. The assistant had seen that fear, however faint it was, and it intrigued him. It was a weakness, a vulnerability. But was it a vulnerability he could exploit, or one that would come crashing down on him if he pushed too hard? The next day, as the assistant entered the office, he felt the familiar weight of anticipation hanging in the air. He wasn't sure where this path would lead, but he knew one thing for certain: it was no longer just about surviving. It was about something much bigger. It was about creating something new, something that didn't rely on the old rules of power and submission. And the rich man, for all his wealth and influence, might just be the key to unlocking it all. But even as he formulated his plan, he couldn't escape the thought that the rich man might be far more dangerous than he appeared. The assistant was walking a tightrope, and with every step, the tension in the air grew thicker. Something was coming. Something big. And no one, not even the assistant, could predict where it would lead. As the days passed, the atmosphere in the office began to shift. The assistant, though still maintaining his calm composure, felt the weight of his plan bearing down on him. He had begun to make subtle moves, testing the waters with those around him, gauging their loyalties. Every conversation seemed to hold a hidden agenda, every smile a calculated gesture. The cracks were starting to form not just in the rich man's behavior but in the very structure of the company. People were noticing things: the assistant's new confidence, the way he had begun to challenge old routines, the whispers of a different future hanging in the air. But there was no going back now. The assistant knew he was close to a breaking point. The rich man's dismissive behavior had only intensified, and with each passing day, the tension between them grew thicker. It was clear to everyone that something was brewing. Some of the more perceptive colleagues began to talk among themselves, speculating on what might be happening. The assistant's quiet strength had become something that couldn't be ignored anymore, and it made the rich man uneasy. There were whispers in the halls, looks exchanged when the two of them crossed paths. Everyone could feel it, even if they couldn't name it. One afternoon, as the assistant walked down the hallway, he overheard a conversation between two senior managers. Their voices dropped when they saw him coming, but not before he caught the words. Getting out of hand. Too much control. Can't let it slip. The assistant's pulse quickened. He didn't know for sure who they were talking about, but he had a sinking feeling it was him. He knew that the rich man's grip on everything was starting to falter, and that made him more dangerous than ever. The closer he got to taking action, the more precarious everything became. One wrong move, and the entire office could implode. Despite the mounting tension, the assistant kept his focus. He wasn't naive enough to think this would be easy. He had made enemies over the years, people who had benefited from the status quo, people who wouldn't hesitate to do whatever it took to maintain their positions. As much as he had been building his network of allies, there were still those who would protect the rich man at all costs. The assistant had learned that power wasn't just about what you could take, it was about what you could control, and right now, he was playing a dangerous game. Late one evening, when the office was nearly empty, the assistant received a message. It was cryptic, just a single line of text: "Meet me. I have what you need to take the next step." There was no name attached, just a sense of urgency that gnawed at him. He glanced around the quiet office, unsure if it was a trap, unsure if he was being led into something much bigger than he could handle. But he knew one thing: he couldn't afford to ignore it. He left his desk without a second thought, the anticipation building with every step. He had spent months laying the groundwork, pushing the boundaries, and now it felt like the final pieces were falling into place. But there was a nagging feeling, something he couldn't shake. It was too easy, too convenient. Whoever had sent the message knew something, but what? And why now, of all times? The meeting was set for a small CAF just outside the city. The assistant arrived early, his eyes scanning the crowd, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea who to trust, and yet, he was drawn to this moment as if it were fate, as if everything had been leading up to this point. After what felt like an eternity, a figure slid into the seat across from him. It was one of the senior managers, the one who had been watching him closely for weeks. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the assistant wasn't sure if he was relieved or if something inside him tightened in fear. "I know what you're planning," the manager said, his voice low but steady. "And I can help you. But you need to understand something. There's more at stake here than just you and him." The assistant leaned forward, his pulse quickening. "What do you mean? What's really going on?" The manager glanced around before speaking again, his words carefully measured. "The company is on the edge of something big, something that no one, not even him, can control. The truth is, he's losing his grip. He's always had this image to uphold, but the reality is, there's a lot more happening behind closed doors. And there are people who are just waiting for him to slip. People who've been planning this for years." The assistant felt a cold chill settle in his chest. This was bigger than he had imagined. It wasn't just about his personal vendetta or the rich man's arrogance. There were layers to this, webs of connections and hidden agendas, and he was now tangled right in the middle of it all. But the thought of backing out never crossed his mind. He had come too far. "So, what do you want from me?" he asked, his voice steady, masking the rush of thoughts racing through his mind. The manager's eyes gleamed with something the assistant couldn't quite place. "You're the key. You've got the leverage, the inside track. You can either watch him crash and burn, or you can help make it happen. But make no mistake, if you move forward with this, there's no turning back." The assistant sat back, absorbing the weight of the words. He had always known that things weren't as simple as they appeared. But this was a revelation. This wasn't just a battle for power, it was a fight for survival, for control of something far greater than he had ever anticipated. He didn't answer immediately. His mind was racing, torn between the opportunity to take what he had worked for, and the fear of what would happen if he did. He had spent years building something he believed could change everything. But this was a different game altogether. Just as he was about to speak, the door to the CAF opened, and the atmosphere in the room shifted. Someone had entered, someone familiar. It was the rich man, standing tall, his presence undeniable. He scanned the room, his eyes landing on the assistant and the manager. The assistant's heart skipped a beat, but he didn't flinch. The rich man had always known how to make an entrance, but tonight, it felt different. He was here, but why? The rich man's gaze locked with the assistant's for a brief moment, and in that moment, everything shifted. The tension in the room thickened, and for the first time, the assistant felt the weight of their unspoken history bearing down on him. The game was on. And whatever came next would change everything. The rich man's presence in the CAF sent an immediate ripple of unease through the air. His eyes didn't linger on the assistant or the manager for long, but the weight of his gaze was impossible to ignore. The assistant felt his heartbeat quicken, every nerve on high alert. The rich man wasn't here by accident. He wasn't the type to stumble into places unprepared. The assistant's mind raced. Had he been watching him all this time? Had the whole office been a game, every move calculated? The manager, seeing the shift in the room, stood up quickly, his face drained of color. The assistant watched the rich man's eyes flicker between them, a slight tightening of his jaw betraying his otherwise calm demeanor. For a moment, everything seemed suspended in time. The CAF, the tables, the hum of distant conversations all faded into the background, leaving only the three of them in a tense standoff. "Mind if I join you?" The rich man's voice broke through the silence, smooth and calculated, as though this were all part of the plan. The assistant stiffened, but the manager, who had clearly already been caught off guard, nodded reluctantly, stepping aside. The rich man slid into the empty seat between them, his presence more imposing than ever. He didn't wait for an invitation to speak. Instead, he turned his attention straight to the assistant. "I've been keeping an eye on you," he said, his voice laced with a strange calm that made the assistant's stomach churn. "And I must say, you've been a bit too clever for your own good lately. Almost like you're planning something." The assistant swallowed hard, maintaining his composure. His mind raced, thinking fast, calculating his next words. Was this a threat? A test? Did the rich man truly know what he was up to, or was this just a bluff? Before he could respond, the manager, who had been silent up until this point, spoke up, his voice trembling. "What is this? You've been watching us? All this time?" The rich man gave a small, knowing smile. "Of course. You think I'd let something this important slip through my fingers? I've known for a while that things were changing. I see what's happening, and I have to admit I'm impressed. I didn't expect you to have the guts to do something about it." The assistant's mind spun, but the pieces weren't quite fitting. How much did he really know? Did the rich man already have the upper hand, or was he testing them, playing some sort of twisted mind game? "You're good, but you're not as good as you think," the rich man continued, leaning back in his chair. "I've been watching the way things have shifted. The whispers in the hallways. The people gathering around you. But here's the thing you don't understand, I've already been preparing for this." The words landed like a cold splash of water. The assistant felt his stomach drop. For a brief moment, he saw a glimpse of the man before him, no longer just the arrogant, untouchable figure he'd grown to despise, but someone who had anticipated every move, every challenge. This wasn't just a fight for control. This was a battle of minds, of strategy, and the assistant was no longer certain who was truly in charge. The rich man leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You thought you could outsmart me. But I've known about your little game from the start. The only difference now is that you're not the one calling the shots anymore. You think you've got me cornered, but let me tell you something, you've only just scratched the surface." The assistant froze, a chill creeping down his spine. How could he have missed it? How long had the rich man been watching him, waiting for him to make a move? He thought he had been the one pulling the strings, the one orchestrating this quiet revolution. But now, it seemed the rich man had been a step ahead all along. Before he could respond, the manager, his face pale and sweat beading on his forehead, pushed his chair back abruptly. "This is insane. You knew all along? Then why? Why are we even sitting here? You could have crushed us any time. The rich man's gaze never wavered. He raised an eyebrow, almost pitying the manager. Because, my friend, I like a challenge. And more importantly, I want to see how far you're willing to go. How much you're willing to risk. This isn't just about one man. This is about power, who holds it, who wants it, and who's willing to do what it takes to keep it. The words hung heavy in the air, thick with the sense of a game that had escalated far beyond what anyone had anticipated. The assistant's pulse pounded in his ears. He thought he had understood the stakes. He thought he was in control. But now, as the rich man laid his cards on the table, it became clear that everything was about to change. He wasn't just playing for power, he was playing for survival. And he had underestimated the depth of the game. I'm giving you one last chance, the rich man continued, his tone chilling. Walk away now, and I'll let you keep your job. But if you push any further, I'll make sure you have nothing left to fight for. No allies. No leverage. Nothing. The choice is yours. For a moment, the assistant didn't speak. The words swirled in his mind, but he couldn't form a coherent thought. How had everything gone so wrong? How had he miscalculated so badly? The manager, still visibly shaken, looked between the assistant and the rich man. He seemed to realize, just then, how deep this went. The stakes were higher than he had imagined, and the power dynamics had shifted once again. There was no safe place now. Every action from here on out would have consequences. But what could they do? Were they already trapped in a game they couldn't win? Finally, the assistant broke the silence, his voice steady but laced with uncertainty. What exactly are you offering me? The rich man's smile was cold, calculating. I'm offering you a way out. But it's not going to be easy. You'll have to make a choice. You'll have to prove that you're willing to do whatever it takes to take what you want. But if you're not ready to do that, then you'll watch everything you've worked for slip through your fingers. The words hit the assistant harder than he expected. The rich man's offer wasn't a simple one. It wasn't just a matter of aligning with him or walking away. It was a challenge, one that tested everything the assistant had fought for, everything he had believed. And in that moment, he realized he had only one option left, to go all in, to risk everything or to lose it all. But as the rich man sat there, watching him with that same calculating gaze, the assistant couldn't help but wonder. Was he playing into the rich man's hands? Or was this the moment where everything truly changed? As the tension reached a boiling point, the assistant's mind raced, the weight of the decision hanging heavy on his shoulders. This was the moment that would define everything, the moment that would determine not just his future, but the future of everything he had fought for. The tension in the CAF was palpable. The assistant's mind raced, grappling with the weight of the rich man's ultimatum. He could feel the coldness of the rich man's gaze searing into him, waiting for him to make his move. The manager was still frozen, watching the exchange with a mixture of disbelief and fear, but the assistant couldn't afford to be distracted. This was at the point of no return. He took a deep breath, gathering the remnants of his resolve. There was no going back now. The rich man had laid it all out. He either played his game and aligned with him, or he walked away with nothing. But the assistant knew something else too, something deep inside him that had been growing over the past few weeks. The power wasn't with the rich man. It never had been. The real power had always been in the hands of the people, the ones who saw beyond the facade, the ones who knew the truth. And now, the assistant knew what he had to do. He leaned forward, meeting the rich man's gaze squarely. I don't want your offer, he said, his voice steady, though inside he could feel the storm swirling. I'm not going to be a pawn in your game anymore. For a moment, the rich man said nothing. His lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and the assistant could see the flicker of something dangerous behind it. The rich man was calculating, trying to assess if the assistant had the guts to back up his words. But the assistant wasn't finished. "I've already been playing the game," the assistant continued, his voice rising in determination. "And I've got the leverage you never saw coming." The manager's eyes widened, a look of confusion passing over his face. He didn't understand. He couldn't see the assistant's plan, but he would. Soon enough, they all would. The rich man's eyes narrowed. "Leverage? What do you mean? You think you can outsmart me now?" The assistant didn't flinch. Instead, he pulled out his phone and slid it across the table. The screen lit up with a recording audio and video of the rich man in a private meeting with several high-ranking officials from a rival company, discussing shady deals and illegal tactics. The assistant had gotten his hands on it, slowly piecing together the truth, waiting for the right moment to strike. "You've been underestimating me," the assistant said, his voice low but firm. "The entire time, I've been collecting everything I needed. The right information, the right people, the right connections. And now, it's all out in the open." The rich man's face went pale as he watched the video. His usual composure was gone, replaced by an unmistakable look of panic. The room seemed to grow colder, the atmosphere thick with the realization of how much power the assistant now held. The rich man reached for his phone, but the assistant was faster, already one step ahead, locking the screen with a simple swipe. "You can't do this," the rich man said, his voice shaking for the first time. "I built this company. You're nothing." The assistant shook his head. "You didn't build it. You stole it. You used people like me to climb higher, to build your empire. But in the end, you forgot that everything has a breaking point. And this is yours." The rich man's face twisted with fury, but there was nothing he could do. His empire was crumbling before his eyes. The assistant had moved too swiftly, too strategically. The leverage he had gathered, the support he had quietly cultivated over the months, it was all coming to a head. And just as the assistant thought he might win, just as he thought the rich man would be exposed for the fraud he truly was, the manager leaned forward, a sly smile creeping onto his face. "You think you've won? This is just the beginning. You've played right into our hands." The assistant froze. What was he saying? His eyes darted between the manager and the rich man. Was this another game? Another twist? The manager's smile grew wider. "You really think you've been in control, don't you? But I've been feeding you information. Feeding you lies. I was the one who sent you the message, the one who pushed you to take this step. The only thing you didn't see was that I've been working with him the whole time." The assistant's heart skipped a beat. He had been set up, just as he thought he was playing the masterstroke. The entire time, the manager had been feeding him false information, playing him like a puppet. He was just another pawn in the rich man's game. "You think you're the only one who knows how to manipulate people?" The manager sneered. "I've been playing you both. All of this revolution was nothing but a distraction, a way to get you to make a move that would bring us back into control." The assistant felt the ground beneath him crumble. He had been duped. The power he thought he held, the leverage, it was all meaningless. The rich man's smirk returned, now triumphant. "You didn't realize, did you?" the rich man said, his voice almost mocking. "This was never about me losing control. It was about you losing your place in the game." But just as the weight of defeat threatened to pull him under, the assistant's eyes flicked to the phone on the table. The recording was still playing, the evidence still there. And suddenly, a new realization dawned on him. "You're right," the assistant said quietly, looking directly at the manager. "You've been playing a game. But you underestimated one thing." The manager's brow furrowed in confusion. "What's that?" The assistant's lips curved into a faint smile. You didn't think I'd record you too? With a swift movement, he hit the button on his phone. The recording switched to a new clip, one of the manager, earlier in the day, speaking with a third party. It was a conversation where the manager had discussed his plans to frame the assistant, betraying the rich man for a quick personal gain. The assistant had anticipated the double cross, recording everything he needed to turn the tables once more. Now, the assistant said, standing up with newfound strength, it's your turn to face the consequences. The rich man's expression faltered, his earlier smugness gone. The manager's face twisted in shock, realizing his own betrayal had been exposed. In the end, the assistant had played the final move, not just exposing the rich man's crimes but also revealing the manager's treachery. As the room filled with the sound of footsteps approaching security, no doubt the assistant felt a strange sense of satisfaction. He had won. The rich man and the manager were both trapped in their own webs, their manipulation unraveling in front of everyone. But just before the authorities arrived, the assistant turned to the rich man one last time. You were right about one thing. This was never just about power. It was about who could control the truth. And with that, he walked out of the CAF, the weight of everything he had fought for now settled in his chest. The game was over, but the battle for justice was only beginning. The moment the assistant stepped out of the CAF, a sense of calm washed over him. The weight of the confrontation, the danger, the tension began to lift. As he walked down the street, the bright city lights no longer seemed as harsh, the noise of the traffic felt distant. For the first time in what felt like forever, he was in control. But it wasn't just about winning the game, it was about doing the right thing. For so long, he had been lost in the pursuit of success, of climbing higher, that he had forgotten what truly mattered. Today, he had made a choice. He had chosen integrity over power, and it felt like freedom. The following days were a blur. News spread quickly about the scandal that had rocked the company. The rich man's empire, once an immovable force, began to crumble. Lawyers, reporters, and investigators flooded in, their presence marking the downfall of a man who had built his success on lies and manipulation. The assistant's name was everywhere. He wasn't just a man who had exposed the truth, he had become a symbol of defiance, of standing up to a system that had long been built on exploitation. For a while, he didn't know what to do with himself. His phone rang nonstop, people offering congratulations, others seeking interviews. But none of that mattered. He hadn't done it for the praise or the recognition. He had done it because it was the right thing to do. The truth had needed to come out, and it had. But the most surprising part of it all wasn't the attention he was getting, it was the people who had quietly rallied behind him. Employees from every corner of the company, those who had once been too scared to speak up, now felt emboldened. They reached out to him, telling him their stories, thanking him for giving them the courage to stand up for themselves. He had unknowingly started something bigger than himself, something that couldn't be undone. The manager, on the other hand, wasn't as lucky. His betrayal had been exposed, and he was swiftly removed from his position. But that wasn't the end of his story. With the information the assistant had gathered, the authorities were able to track down even more of the manager's shady dealings. The truth was far worse than anyone had initially imagined. He had been operating a network of illegal activities for years, using his position to manipulate situations for personal gain. His downfall was swift, and there was no one left to defend him. The assistant, though still recovering from the shock of it all, couldn't help but feel a sense of justice. It was a bitter victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. Months passed, and the company slowly began to rebuild. It was far from the empire it had once been, but there was a new sense of honesty in the air. New leaders took charge, people who were committed to fairness, who believed in empowering their employees rather than exploiting them. The assistant, however, chose a different path. After everything that had happened, he realized that his true calling wasn't in climbing corporate ladders or working under the thumb of wealthy elites. It was in helping others, in advocating for what was right, in ensuring that the kind of corporate culture he had once been a part of would never happen again. He started a nonprofit dedicated to supporting workers who had been taken advantage of, offering them the resources and legal support they needed to fight back. It wasn't easy. The work was grueling, and the challenges never stopped coming. But it was meaningful. He was doing what he had always wanted to do, but in a way that aligned with his values. He wasn't just a cog in a machine anymore, he was the one making the gears turn. As the years went by, the assistant's influence grew. He became a respected figure in social justice circles, known for his unwavering commitment to integrity and fairness. The stories of his fight against the rich man's empire spread, inspiring others to stand up to the systems of power that kept them oppressed. He had become more than just a man who exposed the scandal. He had become a symbol of hope for those who thought they had no voice. But with success came new challenges. The system he had fought so hard to dismantle wasn't going to give up easily. The forces of greed, corruption, and manipulation were still very much alive, and they were far from willing to let someone like him lead the charge against them. He faced constant opposition from powerful figures who sought to discredit him, undermine his work, and silence the truth he was spreading. But every time they came at him, he fought back harder. One of the most difficult moments came when an old ally, someone he had worked with closely in the beginning, turned on him. This person had been by his side during the battle against the rich man, had helped him expose the truth, but now they were seeking to take over the nonprofit. They believed the assistant's ideals were too naive, too impractical. They wanted to make the organization more profitable, more connected with the powers that be. It was a devastating betrayal, and it left the assistant questioning whether his fight was ever truly over. But he remembered why he started. It wasn't for profit. It wasn't for power. It was for the people who had been left behind, for the ones who needed someone to stand up for them. He couldn't give up now. He fought back, but this time, it was a different kind of battle. It wasn't just about the corporation. It was about the values he held dear and the legacy he wanted to leave behind. And in the end, his persistence paid off. The betrayal was uncovered, and the organization was saved. But it was a reminder that the fight for justice was never truly over. The moment you think you've won, the next challenge arises. Years later, the assistant sat in his office, looking out over the city skyline. The world had changed. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. The rich man, now long gone from the company, had faded into obscurity, his name synonymous with greed and corruption. The manager, too, was a forgotten figure, his reputation destroyed. And the assistant, though never seeking fame, had become a symbol of resistance. His journey had not been an easy one, but it had been worthwhile. The company had rebuilt, but it was no longer the same. It was smaller, more humble, but it was also more human. The assistant often thought back to that fateful day in the CAF, to the moment he chose to fight. He had been just another cog in a machine, but now, he was leading a revolution not just in business, but in the hearts and minds of the people. He smiled to himself, a quiet sense of satisfaction washing over him. The fight for truth, for justice, for what was right, it never truly ends. But as long as there were people willing to stand up, to speak out, to expose the lies, there would always be hope. The journey wasn't over. It was just beginning.